Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Greatly appreciate your joining us today. It's Tuesday, October 18th, and we are hosting yet another Center for Civil Society webinar. I'm Jack Fowler. I'm a senior fellow at the center, and we're here to consider and maybe even answer the question, how safe is religious freedom in America? The question kind of implies some degree of insecurity, a degree of a lack of safety, that the status is something less than sacrosanct, maybe at risk. And this even in a nation that established free worship as the first right in the Bill of Rights ratified in 1791. I've done my history work. But in 2022, we're a nation where the chief executive, and I believe even Congress, has tried to order celibate nuns to purchase abortifacients and provide abortion funding. The objective today is to get an honest assessment, maybe even a risk assessment, about how threatened or how secure this preeminent liberty is, and how we, listening and watching, and by the way, this is being recorded, so people who are not watching it live will be able to watch this webinar, whether we should take notice and maybe possibly be more attentive to and active on behalf of worship. The Center for Civil Society is committed to sponsoring webinars featuring distinguished givers, doers, and thinkers who in various ways and on various important topics align with us in our determination to strengthen civil society. And surely, you will forgive me for being presumptuous, surely the well-being of religious liberty is central to whether America flourishes as an exceptional nation, as that thing Lincoln called the last great hope of mankind. Now, I'm going to stop babbling in a second. I'm going to ask some questions of the trio of experts that are here, and we're really grateful that they are here. Let me just preface with this. In his eloquent 1790 letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, George Washington described how the right of religious liberty as a distinctly American thing, how combined with what he believed was the disposition of the citizens of this new nation, how this would promise peaceable and fulsome worship in our republic, so that, and these are in Washington's own words, quote, everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. Which, by the way, that is a beautiful, I think it's one of the most beautiful things any of our founders or leaders over the years have ever written. And it's so darn important. But, you know, it's possible that the father of our country had yet to meet a scheming bureaucrat or a determined ideologue or a partisan jurist, for who among us can, with assuredness, hold the belief that religious freedom is safe in America in 2022. It's possible that this central freedom indeed might be in good stead. It's possible it may be getting stronger. So who's going to decide that for us, or give us the truth, or keep us from jumping off the ledge? Three great experts, and what I'm going to do is they are Monsi Alvarado, Francesca Mazzozzo, and Ryan Tucker. And I'm going to one by one introduce in alphabetical order and ask a question along with the introduction. Ryan, you're going to be last, but that's life when the alphabetical life. So Monsi Alvarado is the COO and executive director of Becket Law, which some of us still know as the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, which I think, by the way, Monsi, people may have thought it's a fund, it's got money, it's got money to grant. Becket's motto is religious liberty for all. And if you look at the scope of cases that it's involved in, it truly is for all. Monsi, I'd appreciate if you would give us a brief sketch of Becket. For example, like you've been there quite a while, but
Yeah.
why did come into existence? What's particular about Becket? And then would you give us an idea of the scope of the religious liberty cases which are in your current portfolio? And finally, if you want to brag about anything, feel free. Like, there are what important religious liberty cases and decisions has Becket been central to in the last, say, decade or so?
Well, I'm happy to do that. Just so that your viewers and listeners know, I have been at the Becket Fund for a long time, for 13 years. So that's, either a joke, or you might think I'm lying, depending on whether you're looking at me or listening to me, but I do dye my hair. And it's been a privilege to serve on a mission that's been around for way before our organization existed, but the organization has existed for about 30 years. So in 1994, we were founded on the basis of Dignitatis Humanae, which is the Vatican II encyclical on human dignity. And based on that, we defend religious freedom for all. It's about the search for God and the fact that that is protected in the American Constitution, and that the government should not be able to intrude on what's in your heart and what's in your mind. So based on that premise, we know that that constitutionally protected right is one that is protected for all people. And that is manifested in our many Supreme Court victories. And I shared those victories with Francesca and with Ryan, who have all been part of this. Well, Francesca's new to the alliance, but have all been part of this alliance of groups that have been fighting at the Supreme Court to make sure that we change the law. We've gone from a society that was protecting freedom from religion about 50 years ago into freedom of religion. And that's very good news. So I'm trying to be Pollyanna over here and make sure that you have something good to look forward to as the law is changing and the courts are changing. We are seeing some good things. The negative things come in a lack of religious literacy. The common language that we had in schools and the biblical literacy that we all shared that allow us to see that a belief in God was worthwhile is no longer. You can see that in the Pew Research studies, Gallup studies, Barna studies, even the Christian communities themselves. Everyone always talks about the Latino community being the future of the church. Hey, we're the fastest leaving of the church. Latinos, especially young first generation Latinos, first ones to leave Catholic and Christian worship. So you do have a sad story ahead of us, because you have to ask the question, who are you protecting religious liberty for? This is what I wake up in the morning every day to do. I defend religious freedom for all at the Supreme Court, full stop. We take cases, we bring them up, and thank God we win them. We've won 14 cases that we brought up to the Supreme Court, obviously a myriad of other cases in the lower courts. But those cases have run the gamut in defending a prisoner's rights to have a beard in prison on death row, to defending the nuns that you were talking about who didn't want to provide contraceptives and abortifacients in their employee healthcare plans, to just last year defending adoption and foster care agencies that want to believe in traditional marriage. Sounds like it's a controversial thing, but it was a 9-0 win at the Supreme Court. So it doesn't have to be controversial. I'll leave that there just because I think that's what's most unique about the Becket Fund is our mission. We're not a ministry. We don't take a position on religion per se, other than the fact that it's good for society and that all religious believers need to come together, and rather than wait for the bear to eat them last, to defend religious freedom for all of us.
Thanks very much, Monse. Francesca Matozzo. I said that right. I practiced. Francesca is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame's Law School, where she now serves as a legal fellow for the school's Religious Liberty Initiative and its Religious Liberty Clinic. By the way, before you did that, Francesca, you were a trial attorney for the U.S. Justice Department. And
I was.
And did any of that involve religious freedom issues? Any of your work there?
Yes, I had some RFRA cases. I also had an Establishment Clause case about "So Help Me God" and the naturalization oath. So that was a fun case to have.
Oh, okay. Maybe we can get to that later. Francesca, Notre Dame Law School, clearly, in part of it anyway, takes religious liberty quite seriously. So would you tell us about this Religious Liberty Initiative? And then there's separately a Religious Liberty Clinic, which seems to me that it's a pointed effort to engage in court on behalf of individuals seeking protection of their First Amendment rights. And then, if you don't mind, give us that understanding of where you're coming from. Maybe also tell us about a worthwhile case that the clinic has been fighting or recently has had some success in.
Sure. Yeah, so the Religious Liberty Initiative was just started in 2020 by our Dean G. Marcus Cole, who's very committed to the Religious Liberty Project. I've been very inspired to work under him. And we're headed by Director Stephanie Barclay, who's a Beckett alum. So we're very, very happy to have that Beckett connection as we take a similar approach to defending religious liberty of all faiths. The initiative side runs a summit, which is done annually, which brings together scholars to discuss important issues of religious liberty, and also works on academic scholarship and promoting the concept of religious liberty through the scholarship activities of Stephanie and some, other affiliates. And then we have the clinical part of the initiative, which has two different sides. There's the transactional, well, technically we have the transactional side, which handles students working with religious nonprofits on advising them on different ways to organize and different religious questions that come up there. We have the clinic's litigation component, which is what I assist with, which files cases across the country and does some other advising projects. And then we also this semester have started an international component. So we have students based in our London campus who are working on international projects. I found the work very fulfilling. Notre Dame is a school where not only do you have faculty and the administration who's very supportive of religious liberty, but our students come very lit with a fire about it. So it's nice to be in that role where you're both engaging students and training them to be good attorneys, but also engaging them in some of these bigger academic questions. I think we've worked on a number of very worthwhile cases since I've been there. We filed an amicus brief in the Kennedy case. We just filed one in the Graf versus DeJoy case about the Title VII exemptions. We filed one earlier in the Oak Flat case that Beckett is handling about religious, the sacred site for Indigenous people in that the government is trying to sell to a copper mining, which will destroy their land. So we've been very fortunate that we've been able to do a wide array of projects. On the international side, one of the issues that we're particularly interested in is the issue involving Uyghur Muslims in China. So we've been doing a lot of activism and advocacy on that point.
Francesca, are there any other law schools that you know of that have a specialized religious freedom component to it?
Yes, actually, it's a movement that I think has been really picking up in a lot of different law schools, which I'm very pleased to see. We did actually a seminar last year via Zoom where we had different scholars talk to all of the clinics together. I think Notre Dame's is by far the largest of that, and we have all these different components. But I think it's great to know that places like Pepperdine, Harvard, Yale are kind of getting into this as well. And I think they're coming at it from a different perspective with a slightly different student body than maybe we have at Notre Dame.
Terrific. So last but not least, Ryan Tucker. Ryan is the senior counsel at the Alliance Defending Freedom, where he is director of its Center for Christian Ministries. He oversees all litigation efforts on religious freedom related to churches, ministries, and religious schools. Ryan, in your bio, it states there is a particular case, Downtown Hope Center versus Municipality of Anchorage, where you defended the rights of a faith-based ministry to operate consistently with its belief. And this is my opinion, I'm allowed to have one, many Americans were and remain clueless about the full extent of Roe v. Wade and what it really entitled. I think there's a tremendous disconnect with what Roe allowed and what people thought it allowed. And I'm making an assumption here that many Americans are clueless about the reality of faith-based ministries and their need to be defended from government officials who swear an oath to the Constitution that ensures those ministries' very freedoms. So two things, Ryan, would you tell us about Alliance Defending Freedom's Center for Christian Ministries? And would you tell us about this Anchorage case and why it's, is it symbolic, or is it symbolic for the kind of things that you do?
Well, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me this afternoon. More broadly, ADF, it's the largest legal organization committed to protecting religious freedom, to free speech, to the sanctity of life, parental rights, and really God's design for marriage and family. Within that broader umbrella, there is the Center for Christian Ministries. And at its core, what that really means is that if there's a church, a religious organization of some sort, maybe a religious school, a homeless shelter, a Christian camp that's facing a harm based by some sort of government intrusion, those type of requests come in through our particular portion of the organization. Downtown Hope Center is one of those. That's the case that you mentioned out of Anchorage. And unfortunately, it is a fairly good example of the type of government intrusion, a threat really to religious freedom that we have seen recently. There's a lot of great decisions, a lot of good things that have happened, as Monsi referred to earlier. There is a glass half full side of this, but in Alaska, just a handful of years ago, the city had passed an ordinance that included sexual orientation and gender identity as part of its protected list of protected classes. The problem here is that a man who was dressed in a pink nightgown, identified as a woman, and showed up at a homeless shelter that was dedicated solely to helping women who are victims of abuse, sexual abuse. And so this man shows up. He was known to the shelter because during the day, they serve not only the women at night, but during the day, they serve everyone, including this individual. They serve them soup. They offer them clothing, even a place to shower. At night, they transform into a women's only shelter. And so this man shows up and he was bloodied and bruised. He had been in a brawl at another facility and kicked out. And he said, well, tonight I'm identifying as a woman and I want entry. Well, he wasn't actually rejected that night on the basis that he was a male. He was actually helped by the center. They sent him to the hospital to try to get medical care, but their reward for being nice was to get a discrimination complaint. And unfortunately, the municipality of Anchorage decided to pursue a claim of discrimination that had been lodged, and it was on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. Eventually, the court determined that the statute didn't apply, that it was not what we call a place of public accommodation. You referred earlier to the situation in Philadelphia with Beckett. Monsi referred to that case. What's interesting about, I think, maybe our broader discussion today is how some of these cases are building blocks. They help one another. And what was great about this particular case, not just setting aside the fact that the court ruled correctly here and allowed this organization to operate according to its beliefs, but the second time that the city came after the homeless shelter, where they tried to amend their local law to come after them a second time, what was great about this was that the case in Philadelphia involving the foster care provider, that U.S. Supreme Court decision highlighted that some of these religious nonprofits are not truly places of public accommodation. They're selective in nature. And so the court was able to look at a great U.S. Supreme Court victory for religious freedom and apply it even to that context in Anchorage, and once again rule in favor of that ministry. But we receive all types of requests. It's not just that. We're in the religious hiring rights space, so we may get to it later, but the idea that I think there's a tremendous threat currently to religious organizations to be able to hire people of the same faith. And there have been some cases across the United States that have ruled the other way. And if religious organizations don't have that right, then we really face a tremendous threat just to the mere existence of some of those institutions. But it's a myriad of different items that you can imagine that come in our door. We're just privileged to serve those that are on the front lines.
I'd like to pick up on something Monsi raised about essentially you mentioned the Pew study, the decline in worship in America. Now less than the majority of Americans have any religious affiliation. So it kind of to me begs a question. And let's put it in this context. And Ryan, I'd like you to answer first, then if Francesca and Monsi, if you would take it on too. And then after that, I want to ask a question about the centrality of the religious freedom right to the American experiment. I don't worship. I do, but Mr. X says I don't worship. Why should I care about religious liberty? And what if a nation is not only majority, but a predominance of people don't worship? Why should that nation care about the right to religious freedom? Ryan, would you like to give us some thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, there's probably a host of different responses. One is just sort of the practical reality of what religious institutions and the church overall brings to society. You know, we think about, I just referenced even the city of Philadelphia, the great Catholic organization there, and the services just Catholic Charities and overall provide to the United States. So think about all the different areas where you have religious institutions, not just impacting society in sort of a moral way, but even monetarily. You know, there have been studies that have shown the billions of dollars, literally, that the United States economy is impacted by these great religious institutions. And if you take away these rights, the ability of these institutions to exist, the ability of individuals to freely worship, there will be an impact to the average individual, one that doesn't care at all about going to church or a deity or anything of that sort. So I think there is an impact just on you know, the individual's daily existence and who and what they come into contact with on a daily basis that they really should care about.
Monsi, would you like to? Monsi, you go ahead, Francesca, and then we'll get to the founders.
Sure. I mean, I think I definitely agree with that. The good that you bring to society, both morally and also in terms of the monetary value, absolutely. I think that for people who don't believe in religion, not nihilists who believe that religion is bad, but people who don't want to define their relationship to God or to a higher power, have to think about Justice Kagan's words. When she talks about that relationship of the importance of religion in society, she says that we're the critical buffer between the state and the individual. So if you think about what happened over the last 2 years where the government had full control over you and could tell you what to do without any limitations, religion is that belligerent, annoying, reliable source of counter effort toward government power where it is undue and unnecessary. And we have a very overzealous government, I would say, and overblown and very, very big government at the time that only continues to self-perpetuate and grow. And so when you think about the role of government, both here in the US and internationally, and how it has grown over time, religion is that very, very important, and it's important to share this with people who don't believe, particularly now, is that very important buffer that allows you to have that freedom to think, freedom to associate, freedom to believe, freedom to be who you are supposed to be.
Thanks, Nancy. Francesca?
I agree with everything they said. I also just think from even just a more personal perspective, I think we all have written on our hearts the desire to know what the truth is. And I think that, you know, even I think a lot of people who aren't religious are not necessarily, you know, hostile in terms of like totally against religion. I think they haven't been exposed to it. I think that they might not be aware of you know, what their first principles are that they themselves hold. And so I think it's also really important to still engage people on, well, you know, have you ever thought about what do you hold on to? Why do you think things are the way they are? It's not just, you know, public health rationales, or it's not just like scientific rationales. Like trying to get people to really have that probing understanding of, you know, an unexamined life is not worth living. So I think that it's obviously important for, you know, the broader goals of society as they both are mentioning, but I also think that, you know, kind of speaking to people one-on-one and trying to get them to really probe, like, do I want to have my own conscience and my own personal, conceptions of what's right and just to be dictated by, this government that's not thinking the way that, I'm thinking about my own personal experiences.
So, let me follow up on that, Francesca. We'll put the founders off for just a minute, because, Jack Phillips, is it the cake baker, wins in the Supreme Court, and yet he is still vilified and I think persecuted. And I'm wondering, look, I don't want to get you all in trouble, but there are people who are indifferent. And then there are people who are hostile, and it seems his case, now it may just be anecdotal, but his case to me is reflective of real hostility towards someone that would want to practice and defend their religious rights, not only privately, but in the public square. So do you sense, Francesca and Ryan and Monsi, if you'd like to join in on this, do you sense that in government there is an increased hostility, increasing? I'm not saying it's majority. I'm not saying it's the defining characteristic, but is there an increasing hostility towards religious freedom?
I think the answer has to be yes to that, to some extent, that that you do see these cases that I think are kind of purposely trying to push these agendas onto religious organizations. I also do think that there's not even so much just from some of the cases that I've witnessed. I don't think it's so much necessarily even like pure hostility as it is like there's this concept of like what we think the good is. We think this is something that needs to be promoted, and there's not really like a thinking about the religious aspect. I think that the Jack Phillips case is particularly egregious and hostile because they're explicitly targeting him. Like they keep on going after him over and over and over again, and keep on trying to make him do things that are against what he wants to do. But I think a lot of times you have these cases that are, very clearly kind of these like big picture, kind of culture warrior type cases where an administration is trying to, enact a political agenda. But I think a lot of times you see religious violations still, that are, these line officials who just don't quite get the concept and are, denying accommodation.
Yeah, obtuseness and not maliciousness.
Yeah, like I think I've seen this in the government, fairly frequently. It's like you have guidelines, you have regulations, you have like your rules, and the idea that you should be taking into consideration this exception to this rule for this person is just something that I think a lot of people aren't able to kind of process themselves. And unfortunately, I think that's why you need to have, places like Beckett and ADF, even for the non purposely targeted things, kind of forcing governments to be aware of what they're actually doing when they're denying some of these rights.
Well, Ryan, is Jack Phillips a more of an anomaly, or it is symbolic of a trend?
I think in recent years it may be indicative more of a trend. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I actually represented Jack in his second case. He's on his third case. You talk about the targeting aspect. You have not only the state itself that came after him, compared him to the Nazis, and just all these other horrible things. But now you have a private individual that also has come after him, and he just recently had we had oral argument in the Colorado state case here just recently. So we'll wait and see how that plays out. I think there's a mix, though. I think there is some of sort of this general hostility. I think some of it's just maybe a general lack of knowledge or caring. I mean, you see a growing secularization, of society. And so I think as you move towards that, you naturally, find yourself in instances where, maybe there wasn't necessarily a targeting or just general hostility. It's just an aloofness to some extent. The thing that I found the last couple of years to be perhaps the most frustrating, we mentioned, sort of COVID earlier, at the beginning of the outset there, while there were still questions, being had about how serious it was. The thing that I found most disappointing was where you had really the church and religious freedom in general sort of being put on a lower pedestal. And that was I think the most blatant example of that was a case we had in Nevada, where you had churches that were limited at first to 10 people, then eventually to 50 people. But you had casinos that were open at half capacity. So you could have literally thousands at Caesars, and they either have 10 or 50 people at church. And, the idea that even society in general, in that case, went up to the US Supreme Court on the emergency docket, where it was denied. And I always thought, surely, the court will look at that and say, that the church, religious freedom is not on a lesser plane, that hopefully we're in a society where, we do place value on our first freedoms. Now, eventually that was corrected. We had a change in the court, and the Roman Catholic Diocese case, and then Tandon, the cases out of California, righted the ship there. So fortunately for that church, they didn't have to live under that umbrella for too long. But, I think whether it was Nevada or a few other instances in Colorado, Jack Phillips, I think there has been indication of direct targeting, but I also think there is a mix too, for better or worse, of simple lack of knowledge or history or understanding.
Yeah. I was going to say, render unto Caesar's palace, seems to be.
There's some great quotes in the dissenting opinions from that case, and it includes that.
Monsi, if you would take that on, but also if I could throw a little twist into this, it seemed to me, and I'm a practicing Catholic, and I won't say what archdiocese I'm in, but there seemed to be a complacency since the COVID situation was mentioned in accepting maybe the secondary level or what, not even being put on a level, just the restrictions that were being imposed. So. That said, the Jack Phillips trend, we'll call it. How do you feel about that? And looking at the COVID situation, were you surprised? Am I overstating it? Were you surprised though that there seemed to be people who should be at the ramparts, the barricades of religious liberty were just not there?
Yes and no. So I think that we describe this as an issue that is rampant with secularization, right? That's one of the reasons why we don't have this shared language anymore, as I mentioned earlier, but we're also struggling with the issue of ideology and bureaucracy, right? So when you ram ideology into bureaucracy, it's very easy to self-perpetuate, which is the problem that Francesco was describing, where it may not be that it's 100% a lack of malice or ignorance, but that you're following orders and that there's a great machine that is willing to churn that out in the administrative state that we have here in our country. So the way the regulations are sent about and the way that administrations are able to jump over the will of the people, especially when you have gridlock in Congress. So when we think about the political process, it's perpetuating this idea of one ideology that's being furthered by the government. But if you put that aside, if you look at the past 15 years in religious freedom challenges, we started with problems in having the creche in front of the courthouse and maybe having the 10 commandments in front of the courthouse. And now we're at, I'm going to force you to provide gender transitions for children. It's a big leap.
Yeah.
And it's a leap that comes to us over a period of time where the law has been acting as a teacher in redefining the definition of marriage, redefining the definition of sex, redefining the definition of employment discrimination. All of these things have changed over the past 10 years maximum and have very quickly put religious believers on their backs. And the problem here, which is the same problem that we saw with COVID, is a lack of a willingness of believers to step up and actually say what they believe. And as a defender of religious freedom, I can tell you that the problem here isn't that people don't believe in religious freedom. It's that they're not articulating properly what they actually believe. They don't have the guts to say, they're hiding behind the excuse of the First Amendment rather than saying, well, I do believe in traditional marriage, and I do believe that abortion is wrong. And when you say those things in this culture, it takes courage because you will be canceled and you will suffer, as Jack Phillips has suffered, but isn't that what we're called to do?
Thanks, Monsi. I have let me get back to the founders and America itself. And this may be a layup for all of you. And then after this, I want you to think about an important case or two. You know, what's in the system right now? And we're being very jurisprudential here, because religious freedom is not only limited to the courts, but you're three legal experts, so we'll stick with your area of strength, unless you want to venture out on it. But is religious freedom, as opposed to all the other freedoms we enjoy in America, is religious freedom at the very core of the American experiment? And I ask this in particular with the belief that the founding fathers were not really all that religious as a group. I mean, but they seem to believe that indeed this freedom was central to this experiment. So, Francesca, why don't I start with you on that? What are your thoughts about the centrality of religious freedom, as opposed to, say, the centrality of the Second Amendment? You know, not knocking the Second Amendment, but you know.
I think it was absolutely vital. I think, you know, that was not only did you have that with the Puritans, you know, coming over, escaping, you know, persecution and whatnot, but there's a really
I think we have
Is Francesca frozen for you?
Yeah, Francesca frozen there.
really
Francesca,
interesting book that was just written by Michael Breidenbach, Our Dear About Liberty, which talks about how even, oh, am I frozen? Hello?
hello, Francesca. You froze a little bit. So,
Sorry. Yeah, where did I leave off? I don't know where I left.
well, I don't know. It got kind of cut off.
Okay.
So
I'll start. I was saying, you know, obviously, I think one of the big parts of the founding was the fact that, you know, there was this persecution, religious persecution that had been going on in England. We're all very aware of that. But Michael Breidenbach wrote a new book called Our Dear Bought Liberty, which talks about how even the American Catholics that came over around the founding were encouraged to adopt this American religious experiment for Catholics' own purposes. So I think one of the interesting things about the founding and the centrality, you know, of Madison with the memorial remonstrance, of the idea that the government has a limited sphere and your faith experience and your relationship with God is separate from the state and supersedes the state, is something that's incredibly important, not only to the founders themselves, but to the communities that were coming in the founding and the immigrant populations that came in, you know, throughout up to the present day. So I really do think it's one of the fundamental strengths of the United States, that we have, you know, this common culture of, even when you have these new religions coming in from different cultures, we have a shared understanding that, you know, freedom to believe and freedom to have your faith community is, you know, fundamental, and that it cabins the state and the state's ability to, you know, control aspects of your life.
And Francesca, before Ryan and Monsi take on that same question, I'm making you a little bit of the historian. I think you've done some comparative religious freedom writing. Quickly, I mean, is America truly unique, or is in current world and in history, historically, is there anything that comes close to America's concept and practice of religious freedom?
I definitely think when you compare it to the European religious experience, one of the reasons why we have, you know, a comparatively robust experience is because we do have our own First Amendment. So when you look at Europe, they have this concept in the European systems of proportionality. You have a lot more rights that are defined. So you'll be balancing like the religious liberty right against the right to work, and all these types of balancing that really downplays the importance of religion. So that's just like one of many factors you have to consider. And I think you see, because we don't have an established church, some of the differences, you know, Madison in the Memorial Remonstrance is warning about how, you know, an established church can really cause the church itself to get corrupted by the power. And I think you see some interesting issues in Europe from the establishment where, you know, for instance, in England, there's articles written about how the church is just kind of aligned with whatever the current political climate is. In Germany, the churches are funded through taxpayer funding, and you designate what church you're a member of. So people have been withdrawing their affiliation with churches so that they don't have to pay to the various churches. So you see how in the US, because we don't have that, because it's all independent and voluntary, I think it allows us to have a much more robust protection of religious liberty than you have in Europe.
Ryan, American exceptionalism, I'm going to say America is exceptional. Is it exceptional because of religious freedom? And is that at the center of the whole kit and caboodle?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I mean, I think the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. I mean, you look at, you know, no country is without its faults. You know, we're all part of a fallen world, but if you go back in time and look at, you know, what the founders put together and how it has withstood time, and just the foundational, you know, principles there, the freedom of religion and, you know, free speech. And when you dive deep into even, you know, the words outside the Constitution and other founding documents, you know, I think it's very evident and clear where most of the founders' hearts lie with respect to freedom, religious freedom in particular. So absolutely, I think that separates us. I mean, all one has to do is look across the pond and see, you know, what our friends over in Europe have experienced, are experiencing, and I think that underscores the importance of really this first freedom.
Yeah, Monty, I'd like you to answer that quickly, and then I'd like to talk about conscience clauses. But before anyone says anything, I do want to advertise to our listeners to visit American Philanthropic's website and click on events, and you'll find a whole range of things that John Hanna, who's the educational director, has put together various webinars for people involved in development and people not involved in development. So visit American Philanthropic. And I want to thank John and Caitlin Nacera, who have helped mightily with putting together this and other webinars. So Monsi, would you take that on? But the centrality. But then let me just put this out about conscience. And then after you address that, Francesca and Ryan might also. So to me, there seems to be a decline in a once widespread acceptance of conscience clauses. That's widespread by my belief. I could be wrong. But especially conscience clauses based on religious beliefs. As America's pandemic rolled out, these seem to vanish by bureaucratic decree. Likewise, in certain states, where abortion is now unlimited, conscience objection that was once entitled to, say, pro-life doctors or nurses, medical school students, pharmacists, they face partisan rejection. So I'm curious if am I creating something out of nothing? Or are there key battles occurring in American courtrooms now related to religious conscience clauses? So Monsi, I'd like you to answer, first take on the exceptionalism, then if you address the conscience clause issue, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I know Francesca and Ryan both talked about going across the pond and thinking about Europe. My experience as a Mexican immigrant and someone who chose America as my home, I think that there's something very exceptional and central about the religious freedom fight. If you know the history of religious freedom in Mexico, the persecution in the 1920s was horrific. And it was the ultimate decision from the government to get rid of religion in the country. And my grandmother was married in secret. My great-grandmother was married in secret. My grandmother was baptized in secret. So there is no faraway memory in my family of what it's like not to have religious freedom. And so I just want to remind everyone how easy it is to lose it. And having lived in Canada for 4 years, I can also tell you that the assisted suicide regime there and the medical aid and dying regime is not stopping. It doesn't really have conscientious objections at all. And they predate us by about 10 years. They changed abortion laws 10 years before we did. They changed same-sex marriage laws 10 years before we did. They tend to be the forward thinking, if you want to put it in that way, in quotations for me, aggressive way of looking at both an agenda that doesn't value the human person and doesn't value religion in any way. So I would say that, again, not to be depressing, but to say there's a lot of work to do, and it's just in our top and bottom border. There's a lot of influence there that is very heavy and leaning in hard. On the conscience clause thing, absolutely that's a problem. Jack, it's the crack in the dam. If you can give people the freedom to think differently in any way from any policy, that policy then might not be legitimate. And people know that. They're very aware of that. They can smell that from very far away. So the doubling down of regimes and of governments, state level, federal, whatever, on their policies without exemptions is precisely for that purpose. And Mark Tushnet at Harvard Law said that specifically when he was talking about the conscience clause cases around abortion and contraception over the Affordable Care Act. So that's definitely a way of thinking, but it's the American way. It's the way that we have always dealt with people who thought differently from a government policy, starting with people who objected to being in the military for a war, standing up for the Pledge of Allegiance, et cetera, et cetera. We have always made room for difference, which is what is at risk here. Civil discourse, the ability to value the person in front of you when they don't think the same way that you think. So to me, that is the issue of the day. And that's why religious freedom is so critical. It teaches us how to have people next to us who fundamentally disagree with us and to treat them as valued members of society and not ostracize them.
Ryan, how would you take on any thoughts you have on conscience clauses, and are there any particularly important cases that Alliance Defending Freedom may be working on right now related to conscience clauses?
Sure. Well, I mean, we see these battles, gosh, in a number of different contexts. I mean, I think your question outlined them: medical providers, educators, government employees, in the gender identity space, employers, public accommodations. I mean, we see it, sort of in a multitude of different arenas. Our life team has been dealing not just with the post-Roe world, which we're all certainly thankful for, but helping pro-life doctors and nurses in that space. We have a website, go to adflegal.org, and you can find a listing of some of those cases. We see too, the inability, just sort of part and parcel of this, of counselors to be able to simply practice the gifts that God has provided them, without being threatened that if they don't affirm certain things or participate in certain things, that they'll be canceled or fired. So there's a number of different cases. You can go to adflegal.org and find sort of a multitude of those. There's a number of cases working their way through various courts. Currently, we, at least this term, offhand, the one case I'll bring up is one relative to Jack Phillips' case, sort of a corollary to it. But I would go to adflegal.org and you can peruse through sort of a multitude of different cases that are working their ways through the court system.
Francesca, why don't you take this on briefly, and then I would like each of you, and starting with you, Francesca, to highlight one particular case that is, it doesn't have to be at a federal level, state level, but one case that you think is of particular importance to religious freedom and the threat, if there is a threat to religious freedom right now. But go ahead, first on conscience clause, please, Francesca.
Yeah, I can kind of combine. So the case that we filed, and I think is particularly interesting for conscience and just in general, it's a contract clause. It's a contract claim of a doctor who kind of seemingly was running it as a test case of, she wanted to provide assisted suicide medical aid in dying in Colorado, and she worked for Centura Health, which is a Catholic health system, or a Catholic and Adventist healthcare system. And so this case has been ongoing, where she's been trying to claim that her firing was due to improperly, that she had taken a step in a direction of this assisted suicide, which she claimed that she didn't. And so we filed an amicus brief arguing that if the courts were to start getting into these decisions about whether her firing was appropriate or not, when the hospital did it because of the fact that she was referring this person for assisted suicide, it would be a huge problem for Catholic hospitals, Catholic doctors, religious medical providers. And we talk about how I think one of the big issues in the conscience area now is you see this argument a lot, and you see it especially in Canada and these places that have very permissive regimes, is the concept that if you have a Catholic hospital or a religious hospital, or any type of religious provider that's in a rural area, so that there might be only like every nurse or whatnot has a conscious exemption to abortion, you should, because you're harming the rights of the person who wants to get the abortion, be able to force them to provide an abortion. You see this case, it's happening a lot in Spain. There's these types of cases that are going on. So I think that's really one of the big fronts of things to watch out for, is that, and also using things like state licensing agreement or state licensing of doctors and whatnot to try forcing them to violate their consciences. So I think this is one of the biggest sources of issues that will be coming up in the years to come.
Ryan, you've got a whole basket of cases that are in the ADF's portfolio, but tell us one that you think is of particular importance.
Well, one that'll be argued, I believe it's December 5th. I think we just got the argument date at the Supreme Court, is 303 Creative. We talked about Jack Phillips earlier, and that case was decided on religious, on hostility grounds. But there were some open questions that came out of that decision. And I think 303 Creative is going to answer those decisions. That involves a Colorado, interestingly enough, web designer named Lori Smith, who doesn't want the state to compel her to express messages that she disagrees with. And miraculously, or shockingly, if you will, the 10th Circuit issued a pretty rough decision that went against her, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided to grant cert in that case, and that'll be heard again in about a month and a half. So that's one we're certainly watching and hoping for. So I would say that one. Interestingly, the court took that on free speech grounds. So, we haven't necessarily talked about speech, but a lot of these cases, the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech go hand in hand. And that one is indeed on speech grounds, but that's definitely one I would say to watch moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Monsi. I know Beckett is big into a case I've written about, the yeshiva.
Yes.
But is that a case that you think is at the top of the list, or is there something else of we should be aware of?
It's 100% at the top of the list. And I would say there's a companion case with a Christian university in Seattle that has almost the exact same issue, only flipped, where it's the government that's coming after them for the decisions that they've made about hiring and firing. So it's a very important thing to remember, that academic freedom for your professors, for your university as a religious entity, whether you're Jewish in New York and it's the Pride Alliance that's coming after you, or whether you're Christian in Seattle and it's the state government that is coming after you. These institutions of higher education are on the front lines right now. They're the places that are most vulnerable to government attack, because they're what's forming the next generation, and the next generation is up for grabs.
We have about 6 minutes left, and we're going to end this with me getting an answer from our three wonderful participants. How safe is religious freedom in America? Should I be on the ledge, or you pull me back in? But before I do that, I'd like to give you a chance to, as I see the fight for religious freedom, it seems like your very organizations are at the core of the fight. But 30 years ago, Congress, Chuck Schumer, was central to creating the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And there seems to be a cooties factor to religious freedom when it comes to others who are in positions to defend it. It shouldn't only be left to your institutions. Are you? Do you believe also that there is a lack of participation in the people's representatives in defending religious freedom? And who wants to take that? Anyone can grab it. Go ahead.
I think, assuming I understand the last part of that, I would say, the more the merrier, I think that, you give RIFRA as an example. It is unfortunate to see that was virtually unanimous, when it was signed by President Clinton. And just recently, even the last, congressional term, I mean, there were attempts to literally get rid of portions of RFRA. And so that in and of itself is disturbing. But fortunately, there were several groups that stood up. I mean, you see they're represented on this call, and there are many others, I think, too, that we could have on a webinar like this. I long for the day where it's not needed, where we don't even have to have these conversations, and maybe my job wouldn't even be necessary. But certainly, it is absolutely necessary now. I thank God for the folks that are on this call. I just think, I would just say in closing, I think we just need to remain vigilant. We've had a great run, I think, recently. The U.S. Supreme Court has issued a lot of great decisions. We've talked about some of them. But just if you look at the last 5 years or so, you see some really good decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court. So while I think there are tremendous threats out there, I think there's also great opportunity to not just win in the courtroom. I think it's so important to win in the court of public opinion. And I think we can do a better job moving forward with that. You see how courts are swayed by public opinion. And so I would just encourage the listeners to be proactive and letting others know why these things matter. And I think that'll benefit us all moving forward.
Thanks very much, Ryan. Francesca, we have 3 minutes left. You get a minute and a half. Should I be on the ledge, or is there the glass more half full than empty when it comes to religious freedom safety?
Yeah, I would echo what Ryan and Monty have said. I think that we've had a lot of great, I'm very optimistic about the Supreme Court kind of restoring the primacy of religious freedom in the First Amendment, rather than solely relying on these political, like RFRA or LIPA ends. I do agree that I think one of the big issues is education of people and the importance of it. And I think that that's something that hopefully the RLI will help at Notre Dame, and these clinics opening elsewhere will help with.
Thanks, Monty. I'm going to have you're going to have to get the last word.
I'll be quick.
No, you got 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Finding the right allies, I think, is the solution to this. We can no longer assume that everyone is going to be part of Christendom, part of that shared language. But you can definitely assume that people of goodwill will see the importance of protecting their right to be wrong, as our founder's book is called, your right to believe in something that someone else disagrees in. So I think that is really where we're at. Can we find those alliances? Can we really believe in civil discourse, and then have a discussion about what that actually means in your personal life? And in doing that, just being very bold and being courageous. So I think you have a lot of bold and courageous people. Ryan and Francesca both have great clients that they defend and that have found the courage. I know that the clients at the Becket Fund are the most courageous people that I know, and they inspire me every day. That's the source of my hope. People who are willing to stand up.
Let me put you on the spot then with one last question, because
Sure.
Raising the issue of the decline in worship and how that might relate to the love of religious freedom in America, let's say 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Do you know anyone who's doing any strategic work thinking about these issues and saying, how should we what do we need to be doing 10 or 20 years from now? Is there anything going on along those lines that you know of?
I think all of our organizations are thinking 10 years from now in terms of changing the law. And in terms of public discourse, we're measuring it, trying to be forward thinking. The next Religious Freedom Index from the Becket Fund comes out in November and gives you a prescription for where people really are at. Where does the average American understand religion and religious freedom? And are those words that are salient to them?
Well, Monty Alvarado, Ryan Tucker, Francesca Matozzo, my friends, thank you so much. I really appreciate your being here with us today, sharing wisdom on such a vital issue. And please know that to those who have watched, who've been with us, thank you for participating. Thanks for joining us. And this will be up on our YouTube page, so we'll be sharing it far and wide, and it's real wisdom to share. So thanks so much for joining us for this webinar on how safe is religious freedom in America. And we'll be back soon next month with a webinar on the nuns, not the ones in habits, but on the actual decline in religious freedom. And in December, we'll be having a webinar on citizenship. So thanks so much, everyone. God bless. Have a good day.